Shock and triage. The first time Scylla saw a human tourniquet bite down on a limb, he felt the floor tilt under him and the lights ripple like heat over a road. The drill had started as a calm exchange of techniques on a dusty landing field carved into the basalt of Kepri 12. The sky wore a thin red haze and the ground was a grid of landing lights and taped lanes. Alien medics from 5 worlds watched with folded hands while the human corpsman stood near a stretcher with a plane pack and a small metal stapler that looked like a toy. Then the sirens cried, and the drill became a real call. A shuttle lurched down trailing smoke. It kissed the pad wrong and slid into a berm. Marines ran. Something else fired from the ridge and the air snapped with hot needles. Scylla tasted metal as he dove behind a crate. When he looked up, he saw the human called Doc Rivera running toward the wreck without a helmet, because he had thrown it onto a patient he was dragging. The patient's thigh pumped bright blood in steady waves. Scylla's teachers had said blood loss was quiet and tricky, but this was loud and obvious and angry. Rivera dropped to his knees and his hands moved like he had learned the motions before words. A strap snaked high on the limb. He twisted a windlass until the skin paled and the bright waves stopped. The Marine shouted, then laughed, then shouted again. Rivera leaned close so the man could hear his voice over the engines and the alarm, and he said, "Stay with me, Hale, you do not get to clock out yet." And the man nodded and blinked like a child trying not to sleep in class. Scylla rose and stepped closer, because his legs decided to obey the human voice. He saw how the strap was not delicate at all. It was simple and ugly and strong, and it worked. Rivera slid a dressing into place and pressed his whole weight down without apology. He told another Marine to hold pressure, and he told a third to pull security because medicine did not matter if a new hole appeared in someone else. This order landed in Scylla's chest and sat there like a stone. A second patient crawled from the shuttle coughing. Rivera snapped a chest seal wrapper open with his teeth and slapped the clear square over a ragged wound that breathed where it should not. The man's breath evened. Rivera kept talking to him in a steady voice that sounded like a calm stream over rocks. "Can you count for me?" he asked, and the man obeyed because the voice made counting simple. Scylla forgot to breathe, and then remembered, and pulled in air that smelled of fuel and hot dust and iron. The Valerie way was different. Scylla's people used careful cuts and soft machines and long songs to slow fear. They used sense to guide the body back from shock. He had been told humans were too rough for such work. He had been told humans let pain do the teaching. Watching Rivera, Scylla thought maybe pain was not the teacher. But a loud neighbor the humans had learned to speak over. An explosion rolled across the pad and scattered grit like rain. Rivera flinched only to check the seal with one hand. He lifted the edge to burp-trapped air and pressed it down again. He told the patient, "You're going to feel weird, but weird is better than not here." And the man actually smiled. Another alien medic shouted that the area was not sterile, and Rivera said alive first, clean later, and his eyes were not unkind when he said it. Scylla heard the words and felt a door open in his head, and behind that door was a room full of rules. Arranged in new order, they carried Hale to the stretcher. Rivera checked his work again because his hands were a clock that struck the same notes at each step. Pulse, bleeding, air. He spoke the sequence under his breath like a prayer. "March," he said. And Scylla caught the letters but not the meaning. Another Marine asked if he was okay to lose the leg, and Rivera snapped back. "He is okay to keep his life, and that is the game we are playing." The answer was not cruel. It was a fence around hope. A small drone buzzed low and Scylla's crest flattened. Rivera took it down with a thrown wrench. He laughed once and then he was serious again. He said to Scylla, "Hold this dressing like it is the last door in a storm." Scylla obeyed and pressed and felt the human heat through his gloves. He thought of the poems about gentle hands, and then he thought of storms and doors, and decided storms were the true poems. Hale went pale and quiet, and his eyes rolled. Rivera snapped an ampule and waved it under the nose and spoke again in that steady voice. He asked questions about Hale's home, favorite food, favorite curse. Hale answered, and when he could not, Rivera answered for him and kept the story moving, so the man would follow the sound. Scylla realized the talk was not small at all. It was a rope. When the shooting faded, the field was a low hum of engines and breath. Rivera looked around and counted lives with his eyes. He nodded once as if checking invisible boxes. He said, "We are still here, which means we get better from here." He checked Hale's strap again and marked the time on the skin with a pen, and Sillin stared because writing on a body felt strange and sacred and also smart. It told the next hands when the clock had started. Only then did Sillin feel the soft pull at the edges of his vision. The ground tilted and his knees wondered if they were done. Rivera caught his elbow and guided him to a crate. He pressed a bottle into his hands. "Drink," he said, "water. First questions later." Sillin drank, and the world steadied and he could smell. The fuel and dust again, and the iron too. But now the smells meant people who still breathed. Rivera sat beside him for a heartbeat and said, "You did fine." Sillin said, "I did very little." Rivera shook his head. "You did not run, and you did not freeze, and you held the door in the storm. That is most of the job." He stood and went back to the line because the job was not done. Sillin watched him move, from patient to patient, like a tide that lifted boats instead of sinking them. And he thought of the teachings he had learned and how they would have to bend. Later, as the sun sank behind the ridge and the pad lights woke and rose, Sillin walked past, the shuttle wreck and the stains on the ground and the tool marks and the torn wrappers. He picked up the small metal stapler and turned it in his hands. He imagined it closing a wound before the body could decide to leave. He imagined telling his teachers that sometimes speed was kindness. He imagined their faces, and he almost smiled. He set the stapler down and looked at the human camp where voices rose soft with jokes and tired pride. He felt fear and respect share the same space inside him, and he knew the next day would bring arguments and rules and papers with seals. But he also knew that when the alarms cried again, he would run where Rivera ran. Because the storm did not wait for long songs, and because a door held at the right moment was its own kind of medicine. The battlefield on Kepri 12 was meant to be a calm training site where human medics and alien healers could share knowledge. But when the siren screamed and a shuttle spiraled down trailing black smoke, the drill ended and war began. Dust and fire filled the sky as Marines shouted and weapons cracked from the ridge. In the chaos, Doc Rivera, the human corpsman, did not hesitate. He sprinted toward the wreck without waiting for orders and without even keeping his helmet because he had thrown it over a bleeding soldier to shield him from debris. The soldier's thigh poured blood in heavy waves, brighter than anything the young alien trainee Sillin had ever seen. Rivera knelt beside him and in one swift motion pulled a strap tight around the limb, twisting the bar until the blood stopped. The Marine screamed and then laughed through the pain as Rivera leaned close and spoke in a steady voice telling him he was not allowed to leave yet. That voice cut through the noise of engines and gunfire and somehow held the man in place. Sillin had been taught that healing required calm air, gentle touch, and perfect sterility. Yet what he saw was harsh and fast, and it worked. Rivera pressed a dressing into the wound with his full weight and ordered another Marine to hold pressure, while a third kept watch for more fire because he said medicine was useless if the next shot found its mark. His tone carried no cruelty, only the certainty of survival. When another soldier staggered out of the shuttle clutching a chest wound that whistled with every breath, Rivera tore open a clear seal with his teeth and slapped it down over the injury. The man gasped, steadied, and began to breathe easier as Rivera told him to count numbers aloud. The patient obeyed because Rivera's voice gave him something to follow in the storm. Sillin felt his own lungs forget their rhythm, and he had to remind himself to breathe again as the smell of burning fuel and sharp iron filled his senses. The Valori ways seemed far away in that moment. They would have sung calming chants and prepared scented vapors to ease pain, but here pain was not soothed, it was beaten back by action. Rivera moved from step to step like a ritual, but not one of gentle ritual, rather one built on urgency. He murmured march as he worked, and Sillin caught the sound without the meaning. A tourniquet here, a chest seal there, and then Rivera wrote directly on a soldier's skin with a marker to record the time of the procedure. To Sillin, that act felt both crude and sacred, like turning a living body into the record itself. The ground shook with another blast. Rivera lifted the edge of the chest seal to release air, then pressed it flat again, telling the soldier that strange feelings were better than no feelings at all. Somehow the soldier smiled, even with blood staining his armor. Other medics from different species shouted that the work was unsanitary, that infection would claim the patient later. Rivera only answered that alive first clean later, and his eyes softened as he said it. The words burrowed into Silen's mind because they made survival sound simple in a place where nothing was simple. At one point, Rivera handed Silen a bandage and told him to hold it like the last door in a storm. Silen obeyed, pressing down and feeling the heat of the human body through his gloves. The comparison struck him because storms were the poetry of his people, and here the humans treated medicine like storms, not like songs. Rivera kept talking to his patient about favorite foods and favorite curses, anything to keep him awake. Silen realized that the chatter was not meaningless but a rope keeping the wounded tied to life. When silence threatened to pull them away, Rivera filled it with words, and the words kept hearts beating. As the firing faded, Rivera stood among the wounded, counting them with his eyes as if tallying victories. He nodded once and said, "We are still here, which means we will get better from here." He checked every tourniquet and every seal again, never trusting chance. Then he crouched by Silen, who swayed on his feet, and pressed a water bottle into his hands, telling him to drink because water came before questions. The alien drank and the world steadied. Rivera told him, "You did not run and you did not freeze, and that is most of the job." Then he went back to work without waiting for thanks. When the sun dipped and the pad lights glowed in rows, Silen walked across the rec field and saw the wrappers and tool marks left behind. He found a small metal stapler lying on the ground. Turning it in his hands, he imagined it closing torn flesh fast enough to trick death itself. He imagined telling his teachers that sometimes speed was the kindest act. He set the stapler back down and looked at the human camp where voices carried tired laughter and gentle jokes. He felt fear in his chest, but also deep respect. He knew that arguments and accusations would come tomorrow when the councils met, but he also knew that when the next alarm sounded, he would follow Rivera into the fire because the storm did not wait for songs, and sometimes a closed door was the only medicine the universe had. The next morning, the field was quiet but heavy with arguments. The wounded were stable thanks to the human corpsman's work, yet the alien medical officers gathered in a circle with their robes pulled tight and their voices sharp. They spoke of contamination, of unsterile actions, of unnecessary pain. They said the human ways belonged to a barbaric past, and that such methods could not be tolerated under the codes of the Galactic Medical Council. Silen stood outside the circle with his crest pressed flat, and his mind torn between loyalty to his training and the memory of blood stopped by a strap and air restored by a plastic seal. He wanted to speak, but the weight of the elder's words pushed him back into silence. Doc Rivera sat nearby, cleaning his kit with a calm face as if the storm of accusations did not touch him. He sharpened his shears and rolled fresh bandages into tight bundles. When one officer shouted that his brutality had shamed them all, Rivera only looked up and said in a steady tone that his patient still breathed, and that life was the measure that mattered. He explained his method step by step and named them like a list: M for massive bleeding, A for airway, R for respiration, C for circulation, H for hypothermia. He said every human corpsman learned this as a prayer and followed it in fire, smoke, and chaos, because if you stopped to sing songs or wait for clean air, the patient would not live to thank you. Some listened, but most shook their heads. Silen could still see the Marine's eyes blinking awake after the chest wound had been sealed, and the sound of him counting numbers to stay alive. He remembered how the strap had turned a deadly bleed into a fighting chance. The alien methods he had studied seemed fragile now, like glass tools carried into a storm. He wanted to shout that he had seen the truth with his own eyes, but fear of disrespect held him silent. Instead, he kept watching Rivera and tried to understand how the human could endure so much anger without breaking. Later that day, rumors spread through the camp. Some council members wanted to forbid human medics from working at the front lines unless they agreed to follow alien protocols exactly. Others said human units would be assigned their own sectors to keep their rough ways hidden from allies. The Marines laughed at the idea around their fires, saying that without Rivera, half their squad would already be dead. Yet the official voices carried weight, and the laughter could not chase away the coming judgment. Silen felt caught between two worlds and wondered where loyalty to rules ended and loyalty to life began. That night, Silen sought Rivera by the edge of the camp, where he sat stitching a torn sleeve with the same focus he had used to stitch skin earlier. The alien trainee asked him quietly if he ever feared that his ways were too harsh. Rivera looked at him with tired eyes and said that fear always walked with him, But the greater fear was to lose someone because he had chosen comfort over speed. He said pain fades but death does not, and he asked Scylla what he valued more, a patient who curses him for hurting, or a patient who never wakes to speak again. The question stayed in Scylla's chest like a hot stone. The next day the council called, Rivera before them in a metal chamber still scarred from the attack. They asked him to justify every act he had taken, and they wrote his answers on cold tablets. When he said he cut clothing with shears instead of removing it gently, they scolded him. When he said he pressed his weight on a wound, they shook their heads. When he said he wrote on a soldier's skin, they gasped as if he had carved into sacred ground. Rivera repeated his mantra, alive first, clean later, and his voice carried no pride, only certainty. Still the elders frowned and scribbled notes and whispered that discipline was needed. Scylla clenched his hands behind his back until his claws pressed into his palms because he could not stand their blindness. As the hearing ended, Rivera was ordered to stand aside until a decision could be reached. The Marines bristled at the thought and whispered of defiance. Scylla walked away with his mind torn open. He had seen with his own eyes that the human way had saved lives, yet the council spoke as if life itself was less important than ceremony. The camp grew restless with whispers of another attack. Shadows moved on the ridge at night and weapons were kept closer. Scylla wondered if the next test would come soon, and if when it came, he would have the courage to choose between the voices of the council and the storm door the human had taught him to hold. The attack came sooner than anyone expected. The camp was still divided, with the council muttering in their chambers and the Marines sharpening blades and polishing rifles, when the sky split open with the sound of plasma fire. The ridge that had been quiet for days erupted in streaks of light, and the first blast knocked out the power to the medical tents. Generators screamed, then failed, and the alien machines that kept wounds stable flickered into silence. Scylla felt his stomach twist as the sacred equipment went dark, because without them many would die. He turned and saw Rivera already moving with his bag slung over one shoulder, and his voice barking orders that cut through the panic, like steel Marines dragged bleeding comrades into the dirt lanes between tents. Rivera dropped to his knees beside the first casualty and pulled a tourniquet from his belt. The strap bit down fast and the bleeding slowed. He reached into his kit for a chest seal, but there was no light to see by, so he tore the wrapper with his teeth and pressed it into place by feel. He leaned close to the Marine and told him to talk about home, about food, about anything. And the soldier obeyed, clinging to the sound of that human voice. Scylla watched, and his heart pounded because the alien medics froze around them, their machines useless, their rituals broken without light. The storm had returned, and only the human seemed to know how to move within it. Scylla rushed forward without waiting for permission and knelt beside Rivera. He asked what he could do, and Rivera shoved a pack into his hands and told him to press on the wound like it was the only thing holding back the sea. Scylla obeyed and felt warm blood under the bandage, but he held firm. Rivera worked on another Marine at the same time, using a needle to pierce the chest and release trapped air. The man gasped in relief, and Rivera kept talking, keeping him awake with steady words. It was messy and frantic, but it worked, and the soldiers who might have slipped away clung tighter to life. The alien medics finally stirred and tried to set up lanterns, but most of their equipment was gone and their hands shook with uncertainty. They whispered that nothing could be done without their proper tools. Scylla shouted back at them, telling them to look at Rivera and see that life could be saved even with nothing but cloth steel and determination. His voice cracked with fear, but also with conviction. Some of the younger ones hesitated, then stepped forward to copy the humans' rough methods. They learned quickly that pain was not the enemy, but the cost of survival. As the firefight raged on the camp, became a blur of shouting and smoke. Rivera moved from patient to patient with the rhythm of someone who had danced this deadly dance many times before. He tied tourniquets, stapled flesh, poured water into dry mouths, and never stopped speaking. He told jokes so crude that Scylla did not understand them, yet the soldiers laughed, and the laughter itself kept them awake. Between the jokes he gave firm commands, and no one disobeyed. His presence was a shield stronger than armor at one point. A blast tore through the outer barricade and threw shrapnel across the lane. Scylla dove, and when he looked up, he saw Rivera standing again, blood streaked on his sleeve that was not his own. He barked for more hands, and when none answered, he pulled Scylla close and said, You are with me now, no turning back. Together they dragged a wounded Marine to cover, and Rivera showed him how to hold the airway open with one hand, while sealing a chest wound with the other. Sealan's claws trembled, but he followed every instruction, and the Marine lived long enough to be carried deeper into camp. In that moment, Sealan realized he had crossed a line from observer to partner. The night dragged on with no end in sight yet. Slowly, the attacks weakened. By dawn, the ridge fell silent, and the surviving soldiers slumped against walls and crates, exhausted but alive. The ground was littered with torn wrappers, bloody bandages, and empty water bottles, yet among the ruin many still breathed, who should have been dead. Rivera sat down, finally his hands red to the elbows, but his eyes still sharp. He looked at Sealan and nodded once as if to say, "You belong here now." Sealan felt pride swell inside him greater than any praise from the council could give. He had faced the storm and held the door as Rivera had taught. He had chosen life over rules, and he knew he would never go back to the old ways. The battle left behind silence but not peace. The camp smelled of smoke, blood, and burned metal while the wounded lay in rows waiting for more help. Rivera moved from one to the next with steady hands that never stopped, even though his eyes were red from fatigue. Sealan followed him, carrying bandages, water, and whatever else he asked for. The alien trainee felt his old lessons crumble like dry leaves in a storm. The council always spoke of patience, of balance, of waiting for the body to respond. Yet here he saw how action saved lives before the body had time to give up. Each step with Rivera was another piece of truth nailed into his heart. They reached a Marine with both legs crushed under debris. Alien medics said it was hopeless without heavy lifting gear, but Rivera refused to walk away. He jammed a rod under the rubble and pulled until his arm shook. Sealan added his strength, and together they shifted the weight just enough to free the soldier. The legs were broken and torn, but Rivera was already wrapping tourniquets above the wounds and telling the Marine that he was not finished yet. Pain made the man cry out, but the human voice kept him anchored. Sealan whispered to himself that this was not cruelty, it was mercy. For the first time he believed it fully. The hours dragged on. Rivera taught without pausing, as if the battlefield was his classroom. He showed Sealan how to pack a wound with cloth when nothing else remained, and how to keep a patient warm, even in heat, because shock made bodies cold. He showed how to improvise a stretcher from torn canvas and poles, and how to carry even when strength was gone by using balance instead of force. Sealan repeated the motions, clumsy at first, but steadier with each attempt. He realized the human methods were not random brutality, but a set of rules carved from countless battles where hesitation meant death. These rules did not care for beauty or ceremony, only for survival. Later that day, Sealan watched Rivera crouch beside a fallen soldier, who was already gone. Rivera closed the eyes gently and placed a tag on the chest with quiet respect. He whispered a few words that Sealan did not know, but the tone carried weight. It was grief contained but not hidden. Rivera then stood and went to the next living patient without pause. Sealan felt the heavy truth of it. Death was not ignored, but it was not allowed to drown the living. Rivera carried sorrow like a stone in his pocket, never discarding it, but never letting it stop his steps. Sealan wondered if this was the true secret of human endurance. When night came again, Rivera finally allowed himself to sit by the fire. Marines gathered around and joked about scars and told stories that would have horrified most healers. They laughed about almost dying, and about how Rivera had cursed them back to life. Sealan listened, and at first he could not understand how. Laughter fit into pain, but slowly he saw that the jokes were part of the medicine. They reminded the wounded that they were still alive and still part of their people. Rivera looked tired, yet he smiled faintly when one Marine mocked his accent and called him the roughest angel in the galaxy. Sealan thought of the council chambers, with their stiff silence, and realized those halls would never understand this kind of healing. The next morning, the council demanded a report. Rivera stood before them with blood still dried on his uniform. They scolded him for unsanitary practices and for ignoring procedure. He answered with numbers. He said how many were alive after the night, how many had been saved by straps, by seals, by pressure and speed. The council dismissed the numbers, saying survival bought with pain was shameful. Rivera did not argue further. He only said alive is better than gone and left the chamber. Scylla followed him out, feeling his chest burn, with anger because the council saw only dirt and not the lives standing in the camp. That evening, Scylla could not sleep. He sat by the rows of patients and listened to their breathing. Some moaned softly, some muttered in dreams, but all of them were alive because of the human methods. He thought of his teachers back home, and their polished instruments and their long songs. He thought of how those ways would have failed here. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he no longer wanted to serve the old council. He wanted to walk the path of the storm alongside Rivera. The decision frightened him, but it also gave him strength. He rose quietly and walked toward the fire, where Rivera sat sharpening his shears once again. Scylla asked if he could keep learning. Rivera looked at him for a long moment, then handed him the shears and told him to start by preparing his own tools because no healer was ready until his hands could shape the edge he carried. Scylla felt pride surge in his chest. The storm had tested him, and he had chosen. Whatever came next, he knew his place was no longer in the safety of songs, but in the fire where lives were won back from death. One rough act at a time. The council called a full hearing on the station above Kepri 12 and demanded that Rivera be judged for his actions. Scylla traveled with him and the Marines to stand before the elders. The chamber was wide and cold with banners of many worlds hanging from the ceiling. Voices echoed like knives as alien officials listed charges against the human corpsman. They said he broke protocols and desecrated the sacred body by writing on skin. They said his methods caused unnecessary pain. They said that if others copied his ways, the galaxy would descend into barbarism. Scylla's crest flattened as he listened because each accusation ignored the truth of the soldiers who still breathed because of those same acts. Rivera stood calm in the center. He did not shout or curse, though many expected him to. Instead, he spoke plainly. He explained the march sequence and how it had been built from centuries of war and survival. He gave numbers from the battlefield showing how many had lived because the steps were followed without hesitation. He reminded them that sterile rooms did not exist under fire, and that waiting for perfection meant watching comrades die. He ended by saying that every scar carried by a living soldier was proof that pain had been worth enduring. His words were heavy, but many on the council shook their heads as if unwilling to hear. Scylla could no longer remain silent. He stepped forward, though his legs trembled, and he told the chamber what he had seen with his own eyes. He spoke of the tourniquet that stopped the bright fountain of blood and of the chest seal that let a Marine breathe again. He spoke of holding a bandage like a door in a storm and feeling life cling to his hands. He admitted that his training had not prepared him for such moments, and that without Rivera's guidance he would have been useless. He declared that he had chosen to learn because truth had shown itself in the field. For a brief moment, silence fell across the hall. Then one elder dismissed him, saying he was young and blinded by human theatrics. Others nodded and murmured agreement. Scylla felt his heart sink. The truth was being buried under pride and fear. Rivera placed a steady hand on his shoulder and whispered that sometimes storms take time to break through stone. They left the chamber together while the council continued to argue. Outside the station windows, the planet turned slowly in its orbit. Scylla looked out and wondered how many more battles would come while leaders wasted time debating words. Rivera joined the Marines in a briefing room where laughter mixed with tension. They spoke of new missions and fresh threats gathering on the border. The corpsman listened quietly while sharpening his tools and folding fresh bandages. Scylla sat nearby, absorbing every detail. He realized that to the Marines, Rivera was more than a medic. He was a symbol of survival, proof that someone would always fight to pull them back from the edge. That bond was stronger than any law written in cold chambers. The following day, the station shook as alarms screamed. Enemy ships had slipped past, patrols and struck without warning. Explosions rocked the decks and lights failed across several levels. Council members scattered in panic, their chambers filling with smoke. Rivera grabbed his bag and ran toward the damage without hesitation. Scylla followed, heart pounding, ready to face the storm again. They reached a corridor filled with wounded civilians and guards. The sterile medical bays were sealed by fire doors and power failures. Rivera dropped to his knees and began working, with the same brutal speed as always. He tied straps, opened airways, and barked for hands. Scylla obeyed without question. and soon found himself leading a group of younger alien trainees who looked to him for guidance. The sound of weeping filled the corridor, but it was not enough to drown Rivera's steady voice. He moved like a force of nature, and where he passed, lives were pulled back from the edge. The young trainees imitated his motions, awkward but determined. Seelan guided them step by step, repeating the human mantra, alive first, clean later. The words felt strange on his tongue but powerful in his chest. For the first time he was not just learning but teaching. In the midst of chaos, guards carried in the high prefect of the council, gravely wounded with a sucking chest wound. Council elders followed in horror, shouting for sterile bays that did not exist. Rivera shouted for a seal, but none were left. Seconds ticked away. The prefect gasped, struggling for air. All eyes turned to Rivera, yet even his kit was empty. Seelan felt the weight of the moment crush him, but then he remembered Rivera's lessons. He grabbed a piece of torn plastic from a ration pack, pressed it to the wound, and sealed it with his own hands and body weight. Rivera shouted, "Good, hold it there," while he prepared a needle. Together they gave the prefect air again. The chamber of elders who had condemned Rivera stood frozen as their leader coughed and drew breath in. That moment the storm had broken into their stone walls. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and none could deny it any longer. The corridor smelled of smoke and blood as the high prefect lay gasping but alive, thanks to the rough human method that Seelan had dared to use. The alien counselors stood frozen around them, their eyes wide with disbelief, while Rivera kept pressing on the wound and giving clear instructions. The prefect's chest rose and fell uneven, but steady enough to prove that the storm had been held back once again. Marines secured the hall while civilians were carried away on makeshift stretchers. The sound of alarms still howled across the station, but in that one corner, life had been snatched back from death. Seelan felt his arms tremble with strain, yet also with pride because he had acted without waiting for approval, and had saved a leader who once condemned the very act he now owed his survival. Rivera leaned close to Seelan and whispered that this was the choice every medic faced in the field: to obey rules written for peace, or to follow the law of survival written in blood. Seelan nodded without speaking because his throat was tight. Around them, younger alien trainees who had once doubted the human way now copied their movements, sealing wounds with ration plastic, using straps for pressure, and lifting patients with sheer determination. The counselors who had sneered at such acts could not deny the results as one by one the wounded began to breathe again. The storm had entered their chamber and shattered their old beliefs. When the attack finally ended and the fires were contained, the council gathered once more, this time with no choice but to face what had happened. The high prefect, weak but alive, was brought in on a stretcher supported by both Marines and alien guards. His voice rasped as he spoke, yet every word carried weight. He declared that the methods of the humans, though harsh, had saved him and many others, and that survival could not be shamed. He ordered the council to reconsider its stance and to study human field medicine with respect instead of disdain. The silence that followed was heavy as stone, but slowly heads began to nod. Seelan felt a strange shift within himself as he stood behind Rivera during that hearing. Once he had been the student ashamed to speak, now he stood as proof that learning from humans was not corruption but salvation. Rivera gave no speech of victory and asked for no thanks. He only stated that the galaxy must prepare for wars where sterile bays will never exist, and that every medic must learn to fight death with what they have in their hands. His calm tone carried more power than anger ever could. After the hearing, Rivera returned to the wounded without resting. Seelan followed, and together they walked through rows of survivors. Each soldier clasped Rivera's hand or nodded with gratitude, and some even clasped Seelan's claws. For the first time he felt not like an outsider but like part of their line. Rivera told him that healing was not about glory, but about being the rope someone could grab when drowning. Seelan repeated the words quietly to himself until they settled deep into his heart. Days later, training began anew, but this time, humans were no longer kept apart. Rivera led sessions where Marines and alien medics practiced together. He showed them how to apply tourniquets in seconds, how to improvise chest seals from simple wraps, how to speak to the wounded with humor and steadiness, so that the mind held on while the body fought. Scylla watched as species who once mocked the roughness now bent close, eager to learn. He himself was asked to demonstrate the very act that had saved the prefect, and when he pressed plastic to a model wound, hands clapped around him. He realized then that he had crossed the bridge from student to teacher, yet not all were convinced. Some elders whispered that this was dangerous, that humans brought chaos into medicine. They warned that order would vanish if such practices spread. Scylla heard them and for the first time did not feel fear. He understood now that storms always brought resistance, but storms also carved new rivers into stone. He was no longer the hesitant trainee hiding behind silence. He was the one who had stood in the fire and chosen life. One evening after drills, Rivera sat sharpening his shears as always. Scylla asked him if he ever grew tired of carrying such heavy responsibility. Rivera smiled faintly and said that weariness was part of the path, but the faces of those who lived were worth more than any rest. He told Scylla that someday he would stand alone in the storm and make the choice without anyone to guide him, and that day would mark him as a true medic. Scylla felt fear at the thought, yet also a fierce determination. He wanted to be ready for that day because he knew it would come. As the station lights dimmed and quiet returned, Scylla looked out the viewport at the stars. He thought of his people back home and their old ways, and he wondered if they would ever understand. Perhaps they never would, but it did not matter. He had seen truth with his own eyes and held it in his own hands. The galaxy was changing, and he would change with it. The storm no longer frightened him because he had learned how to hold the door and keep it shut against death itself. The sun rose over the battlefield, leaving long shadows of wrecked machines and scorched terrain, yet the air was filled with the quiet hum of life returning. Scylla moved among the wounded with Rivera by his side, checking bandages, giving water, speaking words of calm that had once seemed impossible to him. He remembered every fear he had felt during the first hours of chaos and realized that each one had been a lesson written in blood and sweat. The alien medics who once fainted at the sight of human methods now moved with purpose, their hands steady, their eyes alert, their hearts understanding that survival demanded courage and flexibility. Some of them looked at Scylla with newfound respect and even awe, as if they could see the fire that humans carried, and how it did not burn but illuminated the path forward. Scylla found himself standing near a young alien cadet who trembled at the memory of the wounds he had seen. The cadet's hands shook as he tried to adjust a bandage, and Scylla knelt beside him, letting the small claws rest in his hands, and guided him patiently, showing how pressure, how breathing with the patient, how presence mattered as much as technique. The cadet's eyes widened in comprehension as his mentor smiled gently and whispered that being human did not mean being perfect but being relentless. Around them, soldiers who had almost given up on life now laughed quietly as their pain eased and their bodies responded to the treatment. The sight filled Scylla with warmth, a sense of belonging he had never known before, a pride that had nothing to do with glory but with being useful. Across the field, Rivera gathered the remaining counselors and addressed them firmly, yet with a calmness that forced attention. He spoke of life lost, of lives saved, of the necessity to adapt, of the danger of clinging to old rules when the world itself was breaking around them. He asked them to watch, to learn, to understand that human methods were not reckless but precise in their chaos, and that courage was the bridge between fear and action. The counselors listened, some nodding reluctantly, others silent but attentive, and even those who still doubted could not ignore the evidence of survival that surrounded them. The High Prefect, still weak but determined, stepped forward to voice that the humans had shown the value of direct action and that their ways must be studied, not shunned, because in battle, the human heart beat strong and steady, and their hands never hesitated. Scylla felt a strange peace settle over him as the day went on. The worst of the fires had been extinguished and wounded were transported to safer areas. He moved from one station to another, showing how to improvise splints, how to stop bleeding with cloth and glue, how to talk to the wounded so that their minds stayed strong while their bodies healed. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him, hands copied his motions, and whispers spoke of how humans did not panic, how they did not hesitate, how they acted with a certainty born of experience and instinct. He realized that he had become a teacher, not by choice but by necessity, and that the storm had forged him into something greater than fear and doubt could ever allow. As the evening approached and shadows stretched long across the terrain, Scylla and Rivera stood together overlooking the field. The wind carried the scent of smoke and iron, but also of flowers crushed underfoot, of soil turning back to life. Rivera spoke quietly that the galaxy would never be the same after this day, and neither would the medics who had witnessed human methods. He said that humans were not merely survivors, but catalysts, and that anyone who learned from them would carry a spark that could never be extinguished. Scylla nodded silently, feeling the weight and the honor of the words. He knew that every life they saved today was a testament to courage, to adaptation, to understanding that rules could bend, but the will to act must never break. The first stars appeared in the sky, and the wounded began to sleep or rest, their breath steady, their pain managed, their minds calmed. Scylla walked slowly among them one last time, making sure every bandage was secure, every tourniquet checked, every hand held when necessary. The field no longer seemed a place of death, but a place of life, renewed by effort, by courage, by the relentless human spirit. He looked to Rivera and saw a faint smile, one that spoke of approval and pride, one that said the path had been walked well and the lesson had been learned. Scylla finally rested on a small rise overlooking the field. The stars glimmered like distant fires. The wind whispered across the scars of battle, and he understood that the storm had passed, but its lessons would echo forever. He thought of the alien medics who once fainted, of the council who once doubted, of the prefect who almost died, and he felt a fierce joy that humanity had shown what it meant to fight not for glory, but for life. And in that moment, he understood that the battlefield was not just a place of wounds, but a place of teaching, a place where courage, skill, and heart could change the minds of the galaxy. The battlefield was quiet now, only the soft rustle of wind through the scorched trees and the distant cries of returning wildlife broke the silence. Scylla walked slowly over the terrain that had been a nightmare just hours before, and yet now looked almost peaceful. He bent down to touch a piece of shattered metal and felt the weight of what had happened here. The fires had died down. The blood had been cleaned as best as possible, and the injured were either recovering or already transported to safer zones. The alien medics who once trembled at the sight of human methods now moved with confidence, checking wounds, adjusting splints, and offering water and food with hands that no longer shook their eyes, held a respect for the humans that could not be measured in words. Scylla reached the central triage where Rivera was organizing the final supplies, and he noticed the look on the faces of the remaining soldiers. Some smiled weakly, some laughed quietly, some simply stared with awe at the precision and care that humans had shown in the chaos each movement had been. Deliberate, each word spoken had carried reassurance and courage that seemed impossible to emulate, but impossible to ignore. The alien council watched from a distance, still silent, but their expressions had softened, and Scylla knew they had learned the lesson that humans were not reckless in their ways, but relentless in their determination to save life, and that this was a strength no weapon or technology could ever replicate. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, and the shadows of the broken machines stretched long across the ground. The air smelled of smoke and earth, and there was a quiet sense of finality that settled over the survivors. Scylla moved among them one last time, checking that no one had been forgotten, that every bandage was tight, every tourniquet secure, and every wounded soul given comfort and reassurance. He spoke softly to those who were awake, and held the hands of those too weak to move, and in those moments, he felt a profound connection to life itself, a connection that transcended species and borders, and even Pain Rivera approached him with a small nod, and said that the work here was done, that the lesson had been learned, and that the galaxy would remember this day not for the destruction but for the courage and humanity shown by a species that refused to give up. Scylla nodded silently, understanding that this battle was not just fought with weapons, but with skill, heart, and unwavering will. He looked across the field at the alien medics now standing tall, their eyes no longer fearful but inspired, and he knew that every life saved, every hand held, every breath steadied, was a victory greater than any conquest. The first stars appeared. In the sky, the darkness deepened, and yet it did not feel threatening. It felt like a blanket of calm after a storm. Sillin and Rivera stood together on a small rise overlooking the field, watching as the survivors began to move toward their homes. Their ships and their safe zones, the wind whispered through the broken trees, carrying with it a promise that the memory of this day would endure, that the courage of humans would echo across the stars, and that those who doubted would one day understand. The power of heart and action when combined with skill and fearlessness. Sillin felt a deep sense of pride and relief, that all who could be saved had been saved, that the humans had shown what it meant to fight for life, not for glory, and that the medics who once fainted had now become teachers themselves, inspired to spread the knowledge of what they had witnessed here. He looked to the horizon and whispered that the human spirit was unstoppable, and that in every corner of the galaxy those who valued courage and determination would never forget the lesson taught on this battlefield. And as night fully fell, the stars shining brighter than ever above and the winds carrying the soft hum of life returning, Sillin knew that this was not the end, but a new beginning, a testament to the strength and resolve of humans and the difference that one species could make in the hearts of many. The end.